to the beach.
Happy Independence Day week, I guess is what it is, to all of our campuses. And, on that, we always have to remember something, that the default mode of government throughout history has never been towards liberty. We have a very unique situation in our history in America where liberty is kind of the name of the game, and you have to work on it, and you have to work towards it. And it's not been easy, and it's had a lot of ups and downs, but it's going against that basic grain. Usually governments default towards tyranny. And so it's a privilege to get to worship in a place like this where we can worship openly, and I can say what I want. And even if it were critical of the government, which I'm not going to do, you could say that in this country, and that's a rare privilege. So I hope you'll enjoy your week and remember those kinds of things. I'm going to open by asking you a couple of questions, and the questions are a little deeper than normal as far as at the opening, because, and I know some of you, especially if you're new, it'll feel like a question that's like, man, that's like asking somebody to marry you after the second date. It feels maybe it went a little bit deeper sooner than it should, but we're going to do it anyway because, reasons I'll explain here in a moment. How are you doing on your love for God and your worship of God? How are you doing on your love for God and your worship of God? How's that going in your life? Now, the reason I ask it is because Jesus himself said, okay, the most important thing in all of life is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so of all the things we can do, all the things that are offered us in life, there's nothing more important than that one. So it's a good idea every now and then to check, how am I doing in that? And some of you are feeling, yeah, I'm doing great, and it's exciting, it's even emotional at times. Yeah, I feel like I'm loving him more every day. On the opposite end of the spectrum, some of you are like, I don't even relate to the idea. It's one of those things that I don't think about God that much, if at all. It's irrelevant to my life. And we're kind of along that continuum, all between those two poles. And so what I'm hoping, if anything else, we're going to cover a lot of ground today and different things, but I'm hoping that the net takeaway will be an aid and a freedom-giving thing towards that deal. How do we love God? And what does it look like to love God? And how can we do it more in a way that is relatable and is something that can increase in our lives? And we've been in the Psalms during this summer, and we're going to be in Psalm 18 today to explore this whole idea of loving God. And Psalm 18 has a few things to commend it, kind of little factoids about it. The first thing is, it is the fourth longest, I don't know who celebrates whoever came in fourth in anything, but it's the fourth longest psalm in all the Psalms. There's 150 of them. It's the fourth longest psalm. There's a lot of material there. Do not panic. We are not going to go into all of it. But I will say this about it. These long involved psalms, there's some of them, I have a lot of material in them, are I'm convinced, biblical foundation and encouragement for the existence of 1970s progressive rock, okay? That is something we need more of. Yes, and Rush and Kansas and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, that needs to happen more. There used to be bands that did one song was an entire side of the album, okay? None of this repetitive little lightweight stuff. And we need to bring that back. One-lifers, I think you can do it, okay? That's the first thing. Aren't you glad you came today to kind of get a little instruction on those kinds of things? Okay, so it's the fourth longest one. Secondly, it's in the Bible twice. That's an interesting little thing. It's in Psalm 18. It's also in 2 Samuel chapter 22. If you went over to 2 Samuel 22, the entire chapter is virtually the same. There's a couple little differences, but it's in there twice. And I have to admit, I don't know why that is. One of my theories was maybe it was David's greatest hit in the day because he was obviously a progressive rocker. Maybe people, every time he showed up to do a concert, they requested that one. Or maybe it was the one he wanted it to be his number one hit, and everybody kept calling out for Psalm 23, you know? I don't know why, but it's in there twice. Now, I don't have the explanation for any of those things, but I will say this. If you have a high view of the inspiration of the Bible, which I do, I believe that the Lord God of the universe wanted the Bible to be what it is for us, put it in there twice. And I think that ought to at least make us say it's significant, it's worth exploring, and try to find that out for ourselves as we look at it, all right? And then finally, another little thing about it, it has the longest intro statement to it. Before you get in the psalm proper, a handful of psalms have little intro things. Some of them as simple as this ought to be played with flutes, or this ought to be played with strings, or something like that. Every now and then, it'll give kind of the life situation of the person writing the psalm, and that's what this one does. And it's the longest of those, and that's what we're going to read first, and it is relevant and important to us. So here's the life situation given. It says, for the director of music of David, the servant of the Lord, he sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul, he said. Now we're going to stop right there. We'll read what he said here in a moment. But that's very, very important, especially for our purposes on loving God, what it means to walk with God, what it means to worship God. That's the original context. Now that brings up one thing, first of all, that you always have to remember when it comes to reading the Bible, which we always challenge you to do. Reading the Bible always involves three basic application points. The first one is we all have a responsible and honest duty to find out what was in the mind, as much as we can, of the original writer. You know, pay attention to that. You're not supposed to go to the Bible and say, what's this saying to me first? You're supposed to be saying, what was the original person trying to get across? And so you look at that life situation. Now, the good thing about it is that David in the Bible is presented as what we say around here is we want to be extravagant worshipers, which means going beyond expected norms, going beyond what you're just supposed to do. And David is presented as the model extravagant worshiper in the Bible. And so what you're getting here is his life situation. He had been through a ton of stuff, and he's looking back over it, and he finally got rest from it all. And he's looking back, and that's why he wrote the words of the song. Now, the second layer of meaning is always Jesus, several hundred years later, came along and he said, you know what? All of those things that were said back there were about me. I'm the fulfillment of everything that was said. He used the Psalms as prayers. He quoted the Psalms as prophecies of himself. So you're supposed to be looking for Jesus in here. They're about Jesus. They're informing you about Jesus. They're modeling him for that. But there's a very important line, which leads to the third application point. Very important thing he says. He says, for the director of music. He gave, in other words, David gave this song to the larger people of God around the world. He gave it to Israel originally and all the way up till now, so that you can look at these Psalms. And that's why I say, pray the Psalms, own them. You can look at these and you can relate them to your life. You can make them. They're presented to you from God through David to make your worship more enhanced and deeper and have a higher level of understanding, okay? So that's the kind of the thing that's going on there. Now, here's what he starts off with. His very first line, and we're going to read a few verses below it. David begins this way. He's been delivered from his enemies. First line, I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. My shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I've been saved from my enemies. And we'll stop there. And I have a routine that I go through each time I do one of these sermon-y things, or whatever we're calling homilies. I go through a routine, and I pick a passage that I want to, and the first thing I do is always I go and I look at it as deeply as I can. I get to know it. I repeat it. I pray over it. Make my own observations about it. Just try to live in it. Get very familiar with it. The next thing I do is usually I go into word studies. Particular words always kind of fascinate me, and so I'll go back in the original Hebrew and kind of dig around in there and see if there's anything significant. And then finally what I'll do is I'll listen to others, other scholars and commentators and pastors, and kind of get their information on those things. Well, as I was going through that passage, I noticed that commentators stop at the very first line. And they made a bigger deal than I would think of. They would, because he starts off, his very first line is, I love you, Lord, my strength. That's a pretty good line. Sounds like a lot of our modern worship songs. I love you, Lord. But they stopped at that word love and made a big deal out of it, more than I would expect. And it's because that word love is very unusual to use in that context. And it's very important, I think, for us to understand what it's like to love God and all the rest. You see, scholars are of the opinion that because it's in the Bible twice, 2 Samuel and Psalm, one of the lines, the most significant line that's left out of the original is that line. The rest of it's all there. But if you went back to 2 Samuel, you wouldn't find I love you, Lord. It's not that he didn't love God at that point. The theory is that the first one we have in 2 Samuel was kind of the original written thing when he was performing in cheap clubs over in the corner. He's wrote this song and he presents it. It's just right out of this situation. The one we have in the book of Psalms, they think is kind of the remastered version, like the farewell tour version of the thing, okay? And it's more the official version, and they think that David may have come along and put that line there, and some think that it's a summary line. Like, this is the fourth longest song. There's a lot of stuff in there. But that one line summarizes the entire thing. And it summarizes it with this word that's translated love, but it's a very unusual word to use for love. Now, I promise you that I'm not using this analogy because I search for ways to get my grandbaby on the platform every time. I know I do that, but I promise you, before, God is my witness, I did not set out to do this. But it's very related to this. So this week, I get a call from my wife, need an emergency babysitting situation. I'm at work, I'm trying to get ready for this message. I'm studying words, I'm looking at commentators, I'm doing all this, I'm noticing these things. And she says, he'll be asleep. You've come during this time, he'll be asleep. I just need someone in case he wakes up, can't get out of this. So I go home, he wakes up in about 10 minutes instead of the 3 hours I was promised. I think he knew I was there. Thank you very much. I sense, Grandpa, times are about to get good. So he comes in, but I'm like, I kind of panic. So put a cartoon on him, and he likes pretzel sticks, so I'm have that. So you watch cartoons. I'm going to study for this. I'm back in Psalm 18. I'm kind of doing it, Psalm 18, and he's coming over now. He's about 1.5 years old right now. He's about this tall, and it's always been cute. But now, 1.5-year-olds, the cute levels are really like living stuffed animal stuff now at this point. He actually says things where he's not saying any words, but you can tell he thinks he is, and he's very serious about it. That kind of stuff. So I'm over here studying. He's over there, cartoons, pretzels. He's coming over to me to get the pretzels. I give the pretzels. He walks off. I'm all serious, looking at my words. And every time he walks over there, I can't help it. I smile. I watch him. I look at him, and I'm just like, this is the best, man. Look at this. He's so guileless and innocent and cute. On and on and on. I'm not shoehorning this, I promise you. Because you know what that word love means? And I really believe God gave me a live commentary on what that word was really saying. It's the word that's often, most often, it's there like 90 times, it's not translated love. It's translated either compassion or mercy and invokes tenderness. And what it is, they said it's most often used as the word love that a parent or grandparent has for a child. It's that kind of tenderness. When you're watching a little 1-year-old and you just kind of stand back and watch and your heart's tenderized. Now why, that sounds kind of neat and kind of cool. Now what's weird about it though, is they said David used it for God. And there's other occasions where God uses it for people. But David's literally sitting in this place where he's finally at peace in his life, and he's having this moment of, I love you, Lord, with tenderness, like you would talk to a child. He follows it with my strength, and we'll see here in just a moment. He sets it up, he's a poet, he's a musician. He sets it up as this paradox kind of tension thing. But first of all, that's what's going on. It's like worshiping of God, and he's been inspired to think of God in very, very tender, admirable terms, kind of guileless terms. Now, what's significant about that is that, first of all, we don't do that. We're not used to that, and it is unusual for him to do it. But it illustrates a few things. One is that I always feel for people, and I'm sure none of our worship leaders have done this, or maybe they have, I don't know. But every now and then I've heard service leaders and worship leaders say, oh, guys, when we go to worship, we just need to fall in love with Jesus. We just need to fall more in love with Jesus. And someone might cry or whatever else. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think at that point, those of us who are called to love God get real uncomfortable. Fall in love with Jesus. Now, I don't want to stereotype too much, but I think men especially are kind of uncomfortable with that. Like, wow, I fell in love with my wife, but that's kind of an odd thing to say about Jesus or God or anything else. And I've known women who have said the same thing. I feel uncomfortable with that language. And we have those emotions, but here, get this though. Don't you have different kinds of love for different kinds of relationships? If I came to my 18-year-old son and said, son, I just want to tell you, I'm falling in love with you more than ever. Well, he's 18. I mean, and I know what he would say, and he would say it with, you know, a lot of color and a lot of really, really choice, smart alecky tones. You know, please never say that to me again that way. But I tell my son I love him all the time. He tells me he loves me. I don't fall in love with him. Now, what's the point? The point is there's all kinds of different kinds of love, but different kinds of relationship. This is one of those. If you've ever stood, you're not falling in love with your 1.5-year-old, but you are tenderizing, you're watching, and you're admiring, and you're valuing. Love what it has in common. You have friendship love. You have child-to-parent love. You have romantic love. You have all of those things. And what the Bible presents is there's all kinds of love for God. And what's going on with David here is he's at a place in his life where he's sitting and he's resting and he has this tender thing going on. Why? Well, here's the second thing. I introduced you last week to what I called, so creatively and artfully, the Psalm cycle. And I wrote it on a board, and a graphic guy just kind of threw it onto a screen, and we're going to review that a little bit for our purposes here. The Psalm cycle is this, and Psalm 18 is one of these. Not all the Psalms do this, but many of them follow a basic pattern. And the pattern is this. First of all, rescue. The Psalm 18 is a rescue psalm. It's one of those things that says, I need help. Get me out of this mess. The Beatles wrote the song, Help. I wish a Christian would have wrote the song, Help. Please, help me, God. I am in a jam. And he does, and they celebrate it, right? But the problem with rescue is rescue implies trouble. I can't rescue you from your lounger on the Destin, Florida beach when you're drinking your strawberry margarita, your virgin strawberry margarita. I can't rescue you from that situation. Now, you go out in the water and you get attacked by a shark, we can rescue you from that. Rescue implies trouble. There's trouble. The next one, though, is description. Description. And you can go ahead and take it down now. The psalmists talk about it. The psalmists talking about, I need help, and here's why. Here's what's going on. And we said, and I want to repeat this because it's so incredibly important in our worship of God, and our love towards him, and our walk with him. You have to get to a place when trouble is happening, you turn towards him and you articulate it. Because you will articulate it to yourself in your mind. And if you keep it to yourself in your mind, you say these things like, I don't know where God is, and I don't know what's going on, and this doesn't seem fair, and this is a drag, and I hate this, and everything. If you just say it to yourself, it will lead to disillusionment and doubt. But if you will say it to him, he will turn towards it. I have to remind myself this all the time. I'm going to talk to you about this. I'm going to address you about this. And here's exactly what David does. He talked about the Lord being his strength, his rock, but the very next verse, in verse 4, it says, the cords of death entangled me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. I mean, he's probably had it worse off than you. And some of you, though, you've been there. Maybe you've been on your deathbed, or you've been in something that really, really, really felt like the end was near. And then verse 6, beautiful phrase that the psalmist used all the time. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. In my distress. And he writes that down. And again, he's presenting it to all of us. God gives it to us. Sing these songs. God is my rock. He's my refuge. He's my deliverer. He's my rescuer. But I don't leave out the fact that there was a time when he says the cords of death. Can you get this picturesque, poetic thing going on? He's talking about, you ever felt trapped inside a situation? You ever felt like you were just in a prison inside your own life and you're just hurting and you look around and there are no exit. There is no rescue. That's when you ask for help. Help! You ever felt that way before? That's the cycle, and you articulate it, and you describe it. I went back and did a Cliff Notes look at David's life, because remember the historical context. He sang this song to the Lord when the Lord had delivered him from all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now, I was used to David's life. I'd read about it before, but I'd forgotten some things. And I Cliff Noted it and went through. And I won't bore you with the details. But his life was marked by a couple of very, very interesting things. One was that he was called. Actually, when he was probably 14 years old or so, a guy shows up and said, by the way, you're going to be the next king. It'd be like someone showing up at your house and saying to your 14-year-old when they're shooting baskets in the driveway, you're going to be the next king and or queen. You're going to be there. Okay, wow, great. That sounds like a good job. Beats being a shepherd. But he starts his journey, and the next thing he does in the story is he slays Goliath. That's the whole David and Goliath thing, and that's what gives him the attention of the king. And the king finds out he's a musician. He's a great progressive rock guy, and he sits in the king's room because the king loves to hear him play. But the king also was very jealous of him and hated him. And then the king would go back and forth between, David, I love you. You're awesome. You're wonderful. Play some music for me. I like that one that's like 20 minutes long that changes time signatures a lot. And while he's sitting and playing, one time it says the king took a spear and tried to, quote, pin him against the wall. And David's trying to tell friends and stuff like, hey, guess what just happened to me with the king? And then they go through this whole odyssey. In other words, for the next based on what I can tell, about 15 or so years, he does that back and forth all the time because this king is a little bit of a psychopath, and he's always doing this mix of, I'm so sorry, I'm not out to get you. He does that all the time. And David spends his life always looking over it. Can you imagine? And one time, it quotes David. He's hiding, but he didn't feel like he's hiding very good from this guy. And he says it out of his mouth. I'm dead. It's going to happen. I'm going to die. He wasn't always Mr. Man of Faith guy. He was like, I'm dead. It's over. But in the meantime, he had great military victories. He had some great stuff happen. But it's this up and down ride. Can you imagine the frustration? Can you imagine just the emotional toll that it would take? The reason, you'll see, and David did it with, he said rock and fortress and refuge and hiding place. He uses those metaphors all the time. You ever notice that? Why? Because that was his life. It was going from one victory in battle to finding a cave to hide in. And what he learned to do, though, in the middle of the cycle, we put the word refuge. He learned to see God himself as his refuge. And what's all that got to do with anything, or you and I? That sometimes life will feel that way. And here's the thing I noticed, that I Cliff Noted David's life. Did it in about 20 minutes. He was living that for 14 years or 15 years. Years. And for me, I know how it's going to end. Hey, man, you're going to write this really, really cool song that everybody likes, or that you hope they like, and it's going to be preached on around the world, and everything's going to be great, you're going to be the king, and on and on and on it goes. And there was a time when he quoted, I'm dead. It's over. It's done. And you know what he's doing there? He's sitting finally in this place where he became king, and it said, the Lord delivered him from all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he's sitting in that chair going, for arguably the first time in a decade and a half, truly. You ever felt that way before? And he has the sense enough, because he's been doing the psalm cycle and worshiping. He's been relating to God the entire time, seeing God as his refuge. He's able to get to that place where he looks back and he's like, hey, I love you, Lord, because I don't get some of that stuff that happened back there, but here I sit. Thank you. Thank you so much. I didn't get any of that. But I tender-hearted love you because I'm looking back at that. That's David. Think about the pattern of Jesus' life. What we said was the second application, right? Jesus' life was filled with meaning and mission and crowds and healings. But it also said he was a man familiar with grief, acquainted with suffering. He had enemies the whole time. You see his life pattern. People love him like crazy, and other people hate his guts so much that they finally nail him to a cross. To the point where he said, my God, even in that cycle, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a psalm quote. What the heck is going on? Dark moment. Then into your hands I commit my spirit. And then what happened? 3 days later was a resurrection. For the joy set before him. And then he could say, God, I didn't, he would have known what God was doing. But the same pattern, this thing of there's enemies, and there's triumph, and there's stumbling, and there's hurt, and there's darkness, and there's light, and there's this big mix of everything. That's the pattern. And we said at the beginning, I'm going to take you back there again, the Psalms tell you in Psalm 1, there's two roads. There's only two. There are no other. You can be in charge of your life and do your own thing. And Jesus himself said that looks like about a 16-lane LA highway to your eyes. Not that it's trouble-free, but that'll get you there. But what you don't understand is at the end of the thing, everybody's going off the cliff. Everybody's going down to the jagged rocks below. Everybody. It's all destruction. Over here, there's a pathway that looks about this narrow, and it's leading into some woods you can't even see about 5 feet in front of it. You're like, well, where does that go? He said, follow me, you'll see. And it has triumph, it has meaning, and great things that you'll see. Mountains, streams, and beauty, and life. But you'll also be walking on sheer cliff little pathways about this big. You'll fall down, and you'll fall down at times, and you'll skin up yourself, and you'll be bleeding. And enemies will attack. But at the end of that road, there's life. There's resurrection. And there's going to be a moment where you sit there and you're going to say, wow, whoa, I love you, Lord. You're my refuge. You're my rock. I learned that before I ever arrived in this place, but you're my refuge. You're my rock. You're the lover of my soul. You're all those things. And that's the walk. It's how it works. And it's not popular, and it's hard to understand, but that's what it means to love God. And on the way there, you love God in different ways at different times. There's friendship love. There's parent-to-child love, child-to-parent love. There's tender love. There's I don't understand this at all love. But in the end, we will all worship by saying, hey, I didn't get what you were doing, but you did it. There's a whole lot there that we'll explore on another day. But for now, what I'm hoping you will get is maybe for some of you, they're in a season right now that I've been in those. Whew, there's not a whole lot in this. It's making a lot of sense. I'm tense. Describe it. But think of God himself as the rescue, as the refuge, as the rescue, as the rock. And then just wait right there. Someday, somehow, either in this life or in the next, you're going to see the resurrection. And you're going to say with tender heart, this daring, weird thing, will you say to God, I love you, Lord. Here's what we're going to do. We're just going to go into a time because we want to respond well in worship. And at different campuses, we're just going to hand it back to you guys. At this time, your service leaders are just going to invite you to worship in one way, shape, or form to respond to that whole thing, of that cycle, and that place that God's leading us in life. Let's go ahead and go back to our campuses. Here at East, everybody, we're going to invite the team back.